For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, was Ronald Reagan's Cold War strategy successful? Our guest, William Inboden, is professor and director of the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He has helped shape national security policy at the State Department, written extensively about foreign policy in national media outlets, and appeared many times to testify before Congress. He is the author and editor of several books, including his most recent, The Peacemakers, Ronald Reagan, The Cold War, and The World on the Brink. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks for our series Topics in American History. Will, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Tony. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I really love your books. Just such a compelling story, so well written, but also shows a lot of the complexities of Reagan's Cold War strategy, and maybe even a lot of the debates within his administration, as well as the Soviet response. So a complex story, but you made it readable and very accessible.
Well, thank you very much. That was certainly my goal. It was my first time taking up a narrative history like this, but I, having come of age as a kid during the Cold War, I, had those residual memories of just how terrifying and dramatic and uncertain it was, and had a sense that it felt that way for a teenager growing up in Tucson, Arizona, as I was at the time. It certainly must have felt that way to our country's leaders who are navigating, terribly difficult choices with radical uncertainty and quite literally the fate of the world and the fate of humanity and the fate of freedom hanging in the balance. So I thought that telling that as a story, as kind of an unfolding series of difficult decisions and crises would be the best way to recapture that.
Well, you succeeded in that storytelling, and you brought out the drama that you just described very well. Well, first of all, I guess a big question is, what exactly was Ronald Reagan's Cold War strategy before we assess its success or not, and what factors helped to shape it?
Sure. This is one of the most important questions to ask about Reagan, and one that I really try to put front and center in the book. And he, among other things, of course, was known as the great communicator, and he had a wonderfully pithy way of describing his Cold War strategy of this, this huge standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. As Reagan put it, we win, they lose, and that was effective on the campaign trail and in inspiring his staff. But behind that, as I argue in the book, there was a very sophisticated strategy with a number of different lines of effort and pillars to it. And I'll walk you through some of those. But beginning even with the "we win, they lose" phrase, which in hindsight, we can see he was correct on. At the time, it was very controversial that he would even say or think something like that. And I'll do a quick little detour into Cold War history to help our listeners understand just how unique Reagan was with this insight and this new strategy. Every previous American Cold War president, from Harry Truman, who's pretty much our first Cold War president, on up through Jimmy Carter, the one just before Reagan, there were Republicans and Democrats in there. You had Richard Nixon, you had Dwight Eisenhower, you had LBJ. They all pursued different versions of the same Cold War strategy, which was the strategy of containment, and it was predicated on a few principles. One, the belief that the Soviet Union and Soviet communism are a permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape. Soviet Union had been around since 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, some 70 years by the time Reagan's in office. It's not going anywhere, right? It's been around for decades. It will be around for another century. And it followed from that it was inconceivable to actually be able to defeat Soviet communism or end that system. Rather, we needed to coexist with it and contain it. So the previous Cold War presidents, they didn't want to really surrender to more Soviet communist advances around the world. They just wanted to contain and stop those, and then look for ways to reduce tensions and for the United States to be able to coexist in an equilibrium with the Soviets, even if we didn't think we could actually defeat them or roll them back. And Reagan rejected that entire framework. He believed that the Soviet Union was actually a vulnerable, fragile, brittle system, and that with enough pressure, it could be defeated. It could be brought down. Again, in hindsight, we can know that he was correct, but at the time, very few people saw that, believed that was possible. Certainly none of the Soviet experts thought that it was. And moreover, this wasn't just a matter of analytical disagreement. there was real worry that Reagan's more confrontational strategy of believing the Soviet Union could be defeated would bring the world to the risk, or maybe even the very prospect of nuclear war and complete destruction of the planet and of humanity. So again, it's impossible to overstate the stakes here and how radical Reagan's new strategy was. But this is where there's another important thing to appreciate with Reagan is, it almost is a shame I even need to say it. He didn't want to destroy the world, right? He wanted a peaceful end to this conflict. As I've put it in another context, he wanted to keep the Cold War cold. He didn't want to turn it into a hot war. And so with those two principles of his strategy, a belief that that the Soviet Union can be defeated and this conflict can be ended, and yet we've got to do it in a way that preserves peace rather than letting the world be consumed with World War III and total destruction. That's what his strategy was. That's what he meant by the United States winning and the Soviet Union losing. And the way I summarize that in my book is Reagan wanted to pursue the Soviet Union's negotiated surrender. So he wants them to surrender, right? He wants them gone. He wants them to be defeated, but he wants to do it in a negotiated way, and putting diplomacy at the forefront, backed up, of course, by pressure. And I'll just highlight a few of those prongs of pressure. So Reagan's instruments in this strategy of we win, they lose are combining pressure and outreach. Okay, so pressure on the Soviet Union, he does military pressure on them, right? His massive defense buildup. Which is misunderstood as only putting more money into the military and the Pentagon. Reagan is also leveraging American technological ingenuity and innovation to support the Pentagon in designing a next generation of weapon systems, which would be qualitatively better than anything the Soviets could produce. So it was about outsmarting the Soviets as much as it was outbuilding them, and bringing that sort of military pressure to bear so the Soviets would see that no matter how many more rubles they threw at their military, building more tanks or missiles or planes or equipping more troops, they couldn't keep pace with America's technological edge. He also, of course, pursued the ideological pressure, right? A series of speeches and other statements he gave, speaking in very unequivocal and condemnatory ways about the vicious nature of Soviet communism. When he says that they will end up on the ash heap of history, when he calls them the evil empire, the focus of evil in the modern world. Those weren't just cheap taunts. Those weren't just rhetorical turns of phrase. That was part of this ideological strategy of highlighting to the world and to the Soviet people and the other captive peoples behind the Iron Curtain, the other communist nations in Central and Eastern Europe, the ideological bankruptcy of Soviet communism, that it was not delivering on its promises of a workers' utopia and of a better life for its people, that it was impoverishing them in horrible poverty. It was depriving them of their rights and their freedoms, their freedom to worship, their freedom to speak, their freedom to choose their own government. And so the ideological pressure. And then he combined that with what I call kind of the political and human rights pressure, right? His support for religious and political dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, the Catholic Church and the Solidarity movement in Poland, other pastors in East Germany, Jewish and Christian dissidents in the Soviet Union itself. They had no better champion than Ronald Reagan. And he did it because he believed in their courage. He believed in their quest for religious liberty, for political liberty, for freedom for themselves and freedom from Soviet communism, but also because he wanted to use them to put internal pressure on the Kremlin. He knew that any government that invests so many resources in oppressing and controlling its own people is a weak and illegitimate government, and he wanted to highlight that. And of course, there's the economic pressure. Knowing that the Soviet economy was massively inefficient and wasteful and unproductive and wasn't even able to feed its own people. But he wanted to accelerate that. He wanted to show that this system is not economically viable, that it can't keep up with an arms race, that it can't deliver economic benefits for its people. And so that's why, in a number of ways, I described in the book, he brought economic pressure to bear to starve the Soviet system of its resources, especially through the Reagan doctrine, his support for anti-communist insurgents fighting against Soviet-backed communist governments, and especially, of course, his military military buildup, which I mentioned earlier. And he did all this in tandem with allies too. He knew that one of America's greatest strengths was our system of allies, especially our fellow European and Asian allies who shared many of our values. And he knew that the Soviet Union didn't have any real allies. It only had these coerced vassal states that it was treated as imperial properties. And so he used allies to bring more pressure on the Soviets. So those are all the different prongs of the pressure combined with that diplomatic outreach. And I think that's a way to understand the principles and the pillars behind that strategy of we win, they lose.
Right, and something you bring up in the book quite a bit, and really kind of shaping Reagan's vision, I think, was this real fear of nuclear war. Right? I mean, he has this massive buildup, but he's horrified by this prospect of this mutual assured destruction. Right? This mad theory, and because he thinks it'll just lead to world destruction, and he wants to rid the world of nuclear weapons, ironically, despite his buildup. So I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but can you comment on that too?
Yeah, no, this is also really important to understand about Reagan and somewhat underappreciated is, to put it simply, there were two things in life he desperately wanted to get rid of: Soviet communism and nuclear weapons, right? But he saw those as linked. And even though he didn't, he wanted a world free of nuclear weapons, he knew that the greatest threat to world peace wasn't just the existence of those weapons, it was those weapons in the hands of the vile dictators of the Soviet Union and their allies. And so that's why he pursued this strategy that we can call build up to build down, right? First, build up America's nuclear arsenal and our conventional forces to force the Soviets to the negotiating table, to show the Soviets we can deter or defeat any attack you might want to marshal against us. Launching a war against us is a losing proposition. You have no choice but to negotiate. And then once they sit down and negotiate with him, then they'll say, all right, let's talk about a way to get rid of all these horrible weapons, which, imperil the very, the existence of the human race and planet Earth. And so, yeah, he was terrified of nuclear weapons. That's something his critics often missed about him, or when they would deride him as a warmonger. So it was very much a part of his strategy as well. But the sequencing is really important.
Great. Well, let's dig around a little bit and how he went about this, right? During his first administration, I think you paint a picture that he was pretty confrontational, right? In terms of his military buildup, his rhetoric, as you mentioned earlier, about the evil empire, stopping Soviet global expansion, especially these insurgencies around the globe, finding ways to undermine the Soviet system. How does he go about implementing this strategy during his first administration?
Yeah. So again, great question, and very important one to appreciate the context, because when he comes into office, he inherits a weak and underfunded and demoralized military. The American posture around the world, as I've said before, if you were to do a look at the scoreboard in the Cold War at the time, we were losing and the Soviets were winning, right? And so a lot of Reagan's first term strategy is predicated on restoring American strength, military, restoring the American economy too, right? He's very committed to free market reforms at home to restore American economic growth, both for the good of the American people, but also to strengthen America on the global stage, right? If you're going to do that big military buildup that he wanted to do, you got to be able to pay for it. And as I argue in the book, he's trying to strengthen America in part to equip us to put more pressure on the Soviet system. And yet he also wants to keep the Cold War cold and avoid a nuclear war. So how do we square this puzzle of increasing the pressure on the Soviet system? And that's why I argue in the book that one of his strategies in the first term was to pressure the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader with whom he could negotiate. And eventually in his second term, and I know we'll get to that becomes Mikhail Gorbachev. But I emphasize this because I differ with some other scholars who've written on the Reagan administration who argue that he reverses himself, that he's a very different president in the second term than the first term. And I think, no, he doesn't reverse himself. He just recalibrates and adjusts, right? So in the first term, he wants to negotiate. He wants to do that outreach, but he knows that, with dictators, troglodyte dictators like Brezhnev and then Dropov and Chernenko, these guys aren't interested in negotiating. And he also knew that America wasn't yet ready to negotiate from a position of strength. And so that's why the first term is more focused on marshaling the pressure, the series of speeches denouncing Soviet communism, the military buildup, increasing American support for the Contras in Nicaragua or the anti-communist government in El Salvador, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet invaders there. But he's doing all that while generally hoping for a chance to negotiate with and do outreach with the Soviets. And then eventually in the second term, just a couple months after he wins re-election, Gorbachev comes to power, and I know we'll talk about that a little later. But those are some of the key principles in the first term of equipping America to negotiate from a position of strength and bringing more pressure on the Soviets, so that they have to negotiate from a position of weakness, so that they feel backed into a corner, and that they have to turn to a reformist leader.
One of the things I really found interesting about your book was almost like an insider's look at the Reagan administration, because you paint a picture of some of the debates, maybe even some of the divisions between the various department heads of national security, of foreign policy, of the intelligence services, all these different advisors in his administration. So I guess my question is, did this produce a healthy tension and deliberation, or did it impede Reagan's goals with more of a divisiveness? And, where does he sit in all this? Does he maintain control over his administration, or does he not maintain control, and does he allow too much autonomy and too much division?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and it highlights one of, I think, Reagan's weaknesses and liabilities. And, readers will see, or, your listeners have probably picked up, overall, my book is a very favorable assessment of Reagan's foreign policy, and I think deservedly so. But it's not a hagiography, right? It's not the life of Saint Reagan, and I try to be candid about his failings as well. And one of his biggest failings is he was a lousy manager. And just about anyone who worked for him would say he was a lousy manager. He was conflict averse, so he doesn't like it when his staff are squabbling with each other, or his cabinet secretaries are bickering or having bureaucratic infighting, but he won't intervene and police it. He won't kind of crack heads and say, all right, everybody get in line here, right? He would just let a lot of these divisions fester. Some of the divisions were over very important fundamental first principles, right? I mean, how much pressure as opposed to how much negotiation with the Soviets? What's the role of the military in this? What's the role of the State Department? What kind of support, if any, should we be providing to some of these anti-communist fighters around the world, some of whom were personally corrupt and problematic themselves? So now some of the debates were also just over bureaucratic turf and egos too. But I want to give the benefit of the doubt here. A lot of the debates were over important issues. So in that sense, there's a healthy ferment going on within the administration. The problem was Reagan would just let these feuds go too far, and there was a lot of leaking and backfighting and staff acrimony, and it made his job as commander in chief harder sometimes. Now he's a wonderfully good-natured person. He's got a great sense of humor, and he had a great line that he would sometimes use, joking about his administration infighting and some of the bureaucratic chaos. He said, in my administration, we're so confused that the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing, right? So, but he's also getting at some of the ideological debates between some of the more moderates and some of the more conservatives there. And so when you look at some of the administration's failings, the Iran-Contra scandal, which would be one, a few others we could highlight. I think some of his deficiencies in his Middle East policies, culminating, of course, in the dreadful deaths of 241 Marines in October of 1983 from the terrorist attack in Beirut. Those stem directly from this organizational dysfunction. However, so listeners are probably asking, all right, Inboden, so you're describing organizational dysfunction, but you're also describing strategic success and this peaceful victory in the Cold War. How do those fit together? And the answer is, on the issues that mattered most to Reagan, on personal priorities of his, where he had strong convictions and a clear vision of where he wanted to go, and that's certainly the case with his Cold War policy, when push came to shove, he would step in and intervene. He'd say, all right, here's the decision. I'm going to exercise a stronger leadership hand here. I'm going to side sometime more often with George Shultz of the State Department against Cap Weinberger in the Defense Department, or with the CIA against the State Department, depending on what the issue was. When he would exercise that leadership and had a clear vision, that's when he would eventually get good results and would police the bureaucratic infighting. And that's why, and presidents also learn in office, right? That's why I think by midway through his second term, as he's coming out of the Iran-Contra scandal, he finally gets a somewhat more unified team. He's feeling a little more confident in his role as commander-in-chief, and you have, eventually less of the bureaucratic infighting. But the first several years were pretty dreadful on that front. And if you talk to any of the, elder Reagan hands about their memories of the administration, they're very fond of the president. They were honored to serve him. They know they were serving a great man and a great cause, but they also still carry a lot of scars and traumas from all the bureaucratic fighting.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so, can you describe Reagan's progress during his second administration, especially when he finds that reformer, as you mentioned, in Mikhail Gorbachev, and the really important and interesting role that SDI, the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative, plays in arms control negotiations?
Yes, really important. Thank you for bringing this up. So I'll start with Gorbachev, and then I'll pivot to SDI. So March of 1985, 2 months after Reagan has been sworn in for a second term, the Politburo in the Kremlin selects Gorbachev as the new Soviet leader, and he becomes the reformist leader that Reagan had been looking for. He becomes the negotiating partner that Reagan had been looking for. It wasn't so immediately apparent. There were some signs that Gorbachev might be. Thatcher had famously met with him, Margaret Thatcher, the British leader, and told Reagan, "This is a guy we can do business with." Now, she later turned against Gorbachev and later thought he wasn't as much of a reformer. But initially, Reagan's hearing some good soundings there. But it falls to Reagan and his team to start doing some probing with Gorbachev. And then in November of 1985, just let's say 8 or 9 months after Gorbachev has come to office, he and Reagan have their first summit meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is Reagan's first time as president meeting one of his Soviet counterpart. And that's when there's a real breakthrough. They don't have any major diplomatic agreements, but they develop a rapport, they develop some trust with each other, and they lay the foundation for some of the later successes in bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end. And of course, one of the key instruments in that is, as you mentioned, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this brings together a lot of the different strands of Reagan's strategy that I was talking about earlier. So, for your listeners who may be unfamiliar with it, in March of 1983, Reagan gives this very notable, very controversial speech announcing to the world, and even surprising many in his own government, that he has a vision of using American technology to develop an anti-missile system, really a missile shield, multi-layered missile shield, which can protect the United States and, he hopes, our allies from a Soviet nuclear missile attack. And he's derided by many. Some of his critics, especially the liberal Democrat Senator Ted Kennedy, call it Star Wars after the science fiction movie, and they don't mean it as a compliment, right? They mean that this is just in the world of fantasy. It's completely unrealistic. And Reagan knows that the technology will be difficult to develop, and even says, look, this will be the work of generations and maybe 2 or 3 decades, but let's give it a try. And I believe that just as the United States has led the world in so many innovation in so many other areas, we can lead the world in this. But he also hopes that this can render nuclear weapons obsolete, right? This gets to his larger vision of a nuclear-free world. And it also connects with his vision of putting economic pressure on the Soviet Union, because if this SDI can be developed and implemented, no matter how many more billions of rubles the Soviets spend on building more missiles, it won't matter because those missiles can't get through the American system, right? The SDI. And so it brings more pressure on the Soviet economy as well. And even though many in the expert community in the United States were skeptical of SDI and thought Reagan was deluded in thinking it could work, there was one person in the world who was very convinced the SDI would work and was terrified of it, and that was the one guy who mattered, Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And so in every one of their summit meetings, Gorbachev keeps bringing up with Reagan, you've got to get rid of SDI. You've got to stop it. It terrifies us. It's going to erode our strategic advantage. And of course, Reagan is an expert negotiator. He knows how to read the room. He knows how to read the guy across from him, and he can tell Gorbachev is so terrified and obsessed with SDI, this is a great bargaining chip for me, right? Now, Reagan sincerely believes in it, but he also knows that this gives me incredible diplomatic leverage. And Reagan uses his refusal to give up SDI to exert incredible concessions from Gorbachev, such as, eliminating the intermediate range nuclear missiles that he had targeted at Europe and other similar reductions. And so you cannot understand Reagan's Cold War strategy and America's peaceful victory in the Cold War without appreciating the central role that SDI plays.
Right. So Excellent. And so my final question is what we stated at the top. Was Ronald Reagan's Cold War strategy successful? Very straightforward.
Yes, it was. Now, I'll elaborate on that a little bit, right, to give some context, but I think it absolutely was. And I measure a strategy in a pretty straightforward way, or I assess a strategy in a pretty straightforward way. Let's look at the stated goals of it that, the strategist, in this case, President Reagan, lays out, and I described those earlier, his goal of a peaceful victory in the Cold War, of collapsing the Soviet Union while avoiding nuclear war. I look at the means that he employs for it, and I described the pressure and outreach, and then I asked, okay, so does it come about? Now, it's important to note that on January 20th, 1989, that's the day that Reagan leaves office, and his successor, Vice President Bush becomes President Bush. Gorbachev is still the Soviet leader. The Berlin Wall is still standing, even though Reagan had called for it to be torn down, a year and a half earlier. The Soviet Union still exists with a massive nuclear arsenal. And so if you only take a snapshot of that day, you might say, okay, well, maybe Reagan's strategy isn't successful. But in very rapid succession, all the things that he called for and worked towards come about, right? So in November of '89, the Berlin Wall comes down. The people of Berlin take it down. Gorbachev relinquishes control of the Warsaw Pact. He essentially dissolves the Iron Curtain. And then 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself dissolves. And an analogy I've used before, and Reagan came of age during World War II, so this was familiar to him, is, Franklin Roosevelt was the American president during most of World War II. He devised the American strategy of working with the Allies to fight the two fronts against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and Nazi Germany hadn't surrendered yet. Japan hadn't surrendered yet. And yet that happens within a month in the case of Nazi Germany, and then 3 or 4 months later in the case of Japan. And I think we rightly credit Roosevelt with a big part of the American strategy, even though he didn't live to see the fruition. Similar to Reagan, he puts together the strategy, he implements it, and the seeds of it are very far along of coming to fruition when he leaves office. And he's got a good successor in President Bush, Bush 41, who helps manage the culmination of this strategy. But I think it's absolutely successful. It's one of the clearest cases in modern history of a successful grand strategy, I think.
Well, Will Inboden, I want to thank you very much for joining us and talking about your book, The Peacemaker. It was a real delight to have you on.
Thank you, Tony. It was a real honor, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other videos in the series Topics in American History, and also our Cold War and the Presidency series on our channel.